At the end of Paul's second letter to Timothy, we read these words: "Do your best to come quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica." One can almost feel the pain in Paul's heart as he writes these words to Timothy. Now, there are three references to Demas in the New Testament. The first reference is in Philemon, verse 24, where he talks about Demas being a fellow worker. And then over in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 14, Paul talks about some of the key workers in his ministry, and he names Demas as one of these key workers. Demas was obviously a very gifted young man, and he was at the center of Paul's mission plans. And yet there's a gap of several years, and then Paul, imprisoned in Rome under sentence of death, writes, "Demas, because he loved the world, has deserted me." Demas not only abandoned Paul, he also, the implication being, is that he abandoned the Christian faith as well. Now, the word which is translated love or loved in this verse is the word agape. It's the same word, for example, which appears in John chapter 3 and verse 16, where it says that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Now, the use of this word is very important because it is actually saying that this was not a passing infatuation by Demas. It seems that once he loved the Lord, once he was at the center of God's mission plans, and now he loves the world. Now he is infatuated by the world. Now the question is, of course, how does this happen? It happens by small, almost imperceptible increments. It may be our missed worship service. It may be the secret doubt which we've left unaddressed. It may be the secret habit which has grown until it controls our life. We abandon the Lord's plan for our life by small increments. The Danish philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard tells the story of a wild duck. Now, this wild duck was part of a flock which migrated from North America to Europe every winter. And he tells the story of this duck one day when flying over a farmyard, sees a flock of domesticated ducks, and the curiosity got the better of him, and he flew down to join his domesticated cousins. And soon after joining them, the farmer's wife came into the farmyard and threw grain out to feed the ducks. And it was a very enjoyable experience. But, you know, the wild duck fully intended to join his wild cousins on their journey later on. However, it was getting late and the barn door was opened and the ducks were proceeding into the barn to spend their night. And so he spent their night with his domesticated cousins. And the next day he fully intended to carry on his migration journey. But the temptation got the better of him and he stayed. And a day turned into a week, and turned into a month, turned into a season. And soon his wild ducks were flying back to North America. And as they were flying overhead, he could hear their call. And he looked up and he made as though he was going to join them. And he flapped his wings, but that's as far as he got. He was once a wild duck that soared high, and now he couldn't fly at all. Now, I tell you this story because it is actually a description of what happens to many Christians. Many Christians set off in the Christian life with good intentions. They set off to do their best for the Lord, but they get waylaid. God had a great plan for their life, but now they seem to be grounded, flapping around, not knowing where God is leading them. And it may be that this morning that describes your life, that you know that God had a plan for your life, but now it seems to be that you are no longer in the center of God's will. The Apostle Paul we read at the end of Romans, had a vision. And the reason he went to Rome was that he wanted Rome to be a center, a mission center for his new mission outreach. And that was to go from Rome to Spain and the regions beyond. And to achieve this purpose, Paul gathered round him a group of very gifted men and women who would be his key workers. Now, Demas was one of these key workers. He was one of that team. We also know from the New Testament that the Apostle Paul could be a very difficult person to work with. We know from the story of Mark and Paul and Silas that one time Mark gave up and wanted to go home, and Paul just wrote him off. He was a demanding taskmaster. He wanted to be single-minded, and he wanted the people around him to be single-minded. Now, however, at this point in life, Paul was getting old. And it may be that as Demas looked at the Apostle Paul, he decided, well, you don't have to be that single-minded. As it were, you could have your cake and eat it. You could actually have a low-key Christian life and then enjoy the rewards of eternity afterwards. And it may be that he gave up on the God's plan for his life because he felt tempted to a lower standard of discipleship. However, it could also be that he gave up because being in Rome, he was surrounded by the glitz and glamour of Roman life. And compared to the church, the church looked dour. It looked ordinary, even tardy. However, according to Paul, the church was beginning to make inroads into the higher echelons of Roman society. He writes that the gospel is known even in Caesar's household. And it may be, and we don't know for sure, it may be that Demas got to know these people from the higher echelons of Roman society, and he felt tempted to go along with them. And when he went along with them, he found that he fitted in. And he found that he actually enjoyed being part of that crowd. We don't know. But what we do know is that Demas ended up being infatuated, in love with the world. God had a plan for his life, and now he was going in the opposite direction. Perhaps if Demas had continued being faithful to his Lord, he might have ended up as one of the great church fathers. We might have heard of Demas. We might have had colleges and churches named after Saint Dimas. But his only epitaph is the epitaph Paul gives him in 2 Timothy, that he had forsaken me because he loved the world. Instead of going west to Spain, he went east to Thessalonica. Now, archaeologists, when they were digging in the ruins of Thessalonica, came upon lists of prominent people from the time of the Apostle Paul in the first century. And among that list of prominent people, people who were successful in their society, was one Demas. Now, Demas was not a common name, but we don't know for sure whether the Demas mentioned in that list of prominent people was the same Demas referred to by Paul in 2 Timothy. But let's suppose for a moment that it was. Demas was obviously a very gifted young man. He obviously was very driven because he wanted to share the gospel of Christ. He went out there. And that sort of drivenness can not only be used for the sake of the gospel, it can be used to make yourself rich. Now just imagine for a time that Demas went to Thessalonica. He made a success of his life. He married, had children. He had a house in the city and a villa by the blue Aegean Sea. He'd made a success of his life from everybody else's perspectives, but not from his own perspective, because I can imagine in the quiet moments he would reflect and he would hear the Lord say to him, Demas, Demas, what shall it profit a man if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? And Jesus is not only talking about losing our salvation. He's talking about losing our direction in life, losing our focus in life. And the question is, I want to pose to you this morning, is that did you set off in good intentions in the Christian life and you found your way waylaid? Now, the question which we need to address in these closing moments is, how do we get back on track? How do we get back to where God wants us to be? And I think the answer is found in Psalm 51. If you remember, Psalm 51 was written by King David at a very low point in his life when he had sinned with Bathsheba, and Nathan the prophet had come along and convicted him, and he felt the conviction of God. And at one point in this psalm he writes, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation." And joy, the joy of the Lord, that deep sense of the presence of the Lord, is a key indicator whether we're going on with God. It may be that we've made a success of our life to everyone round about us, but we know in our hearts that we're missing out on God's best for our life. The shorter Westminster Catechism of Faith asks the question, what is the chief end of man? And then it gives the answer as, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And it may be that you've lost the joy of your salvation. And the question is, how has that come about? It may, of course, be sin and disobedience. Sometimes we know what we need to do, but we say no to the Lord. It's not a question of doing something really bad morally. It's not about being a bad person. It's about choosing the second best. It's about choosing the good over God's best for your life. I like John Wesley's definition of sin, where he says, whatever weakens your reason, whatever impairs your tenderness of your conscience, whatever obscures your sense of God and takes away the relish of spiritual things, that to you is sin. Now, it may be that you've lost the joy of your salvation through disobedience, choosing the good over God's best. However, it may be that you are physically, emotionally, and spiritually exhausted as a result of the way that you have been doing church for all these years. Now, it looks very spiritual for a church to have a full program of events where there isn't, as it were, an hour free in the whole week, where it's always mission, it's always worship, it's always this, that, and the other. It looks very spiritual. It looks very spiritual for a person to live all their life busy, as it were, about the Lord's business. But we know deep in our hearts that busyness cannot be equated to spirituality. Now, in my experience, and I say this with great sincerity because I know I'll be speaking to people here this morning, being labeled a backslider doesn't necessarily mean that you've given up on your faith. And it may be that some have labeled you a backslider, but you haven't given up on your faith. It's just that you're weary of the treadmill of church life, one thing after the other. You want to get back to a deeper relationship with the Lord. Now, the key is not to give up on the Lord, not to give up on your faith, but have the courage of your convictions to simplify your life and focus in on what is important, and that is your relationship with the Lord. That's what is of primary importance. Now, truth is, we have no idea whatsoever happened to Demas. We don't know whether he returned to the Lord in later life. Well, we can be assured that if he did return to the Lord, that the Lord would have received him with open arms. And I want to assure you this morning that you are not beyond the love of God. You have not put yourself beyond the love of God. You may feel a failure. You may feel the Lord saying to you time and time, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? You may have feel you've lost your soul because you have lost your direction in life. But I want to assure you, you can come back to the Lord right now. You can start again. God can restore the years that the locusts have eaten. The Lord can restore the joy of your salvation. Will you open your heart to him right now? And will you start again with the Lord? Amen.